And I will introduce our panel in sequence as each makes a presentation. What we hope to achieve in the next hour and 45 minutes is a broader examination, understanding of where we are in this nation's current two wars. We've been at them for a while. They've generated a great deal of angst in our nation, disagreement, hope, expectation, in some cases maybe despair. We have four people who have vested themselves a great deal in this topic, both in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think it will be interesting to you to hear where they think we are in both cases and where we're liable to be in the future. I intend to moderate this, but not to offer a great deal of my own views, although I've made 8 trips to Iraq and 4 to Afghanistan and 2 to Pakistan, so I'm not unfamiliar with the wars. But what I want you to hear is what 3 important scholars have to say, and 1 sort of rambling journalist. And more on that later. John Nagl is going to lead off, and he's going to talk to us about his views on Afghanistan. Nagl is a soldier scholar, as I think most of you know. Everybody who's in this conference today knows who our panelists are, but let me add just a couple of refreshing thoughts. John Nagl is a West Point graduate, class of '88, a Rhodes Scholar, a PhD from Oxford, a man who has served in combat. He led a tank platoon in the first Gulf War and was an operations officer in the tank battalion in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Those credentials matter to me, probably matter to most of you. He's also a scholar of serious note and has running the Center for New American Security, brought his own views and those of his own organization into the public domain quite prominently. I'm eager to hear what he has to say about Afghanistan.
Thank you, General Boyd. Let me begin by congratulating the Nixon Center. It is an organization that has pulled together, I think, a number of discussions over the next 2 days on subjects of great importance to the national interest. And I was privileged to be asked by the national interest to participate in a debate with Paul Pillar, from whom you'll hear in a few moments, on the question of Afghanistan. And I think that that sort of debate is enormously important when we are in a time of war, when we are fighting a campaign, several campaigns that are hard to understand, where progress is hard to measure, where war goals may not be completely clear. And so what I'd like to do today is make the argument that the wars we're fighting in Afghanistan and Pakistan are very strongly in our national interest, and that it's possible for us to achieve success there. So what I'd like to talk about just briefly is what success looks like, why success matters, and why I think we can win. Success in wars against irregular enemies can be very difficult to define. In Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it's important, and I think one of the major products of this administration's strategic review early in 2009 was the understanding that in Afghanistan and Pakistan we're really fighting one war with different rules on 2 sides of the Durand line. A stable and secure Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is not a base for terror and does not destabilize the region, is the definition, I think, of what we're trying to achieve there. That is what success looks like. I would argue that defeat of al-Qaeda is a necessary but insufficient condition for success. The defeat of al-Qaeda is important, but it by itself does not define success, which is an Afghanistan and a Pakistan that can, broadly speaking, stand on their own against internal threats. And today is unfortunately a day when why this matters is disturbingly clear. We've seen in the news today the juxtaposition of a truck bomb attack in Kabul that killed at least 5 American soldiers, one other NATO soldier, and at least a dozen Afghans, wounded dozens more grievously. And when you juxtapose that attack with the attempted truck bomb in Times Square by a bomber who reportedly trained in North Waziristan in Pakistan, that's a good reminder of why Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, called the Afghanistan-Pakistan border the epicenter for global terrorism. As long as that threat remains to the United States, we have a real interest in achieving stability and security in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I'd like to, and I believe that war is very winnable. I'd like to provide 3 reasons why I think we can win. First, I think we finally have the coin strategy correct and have begun to resource it. I think the Taliban is under enormous pressure for a number of reasons, and I think the Afghan government, and particularly the Afghan security forces, are improving. A few words on each of those. First, the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I think, can only be perceived, can be understood if one understands that this became very much a supporting effort, an economy of force effort for essentially 8 years. Even before the Taliban had been toppled in Afghanistan, the attention of the United States had begun to shift to another war in Iraq. And we didn't start resourcing effort appropriately until 2009. In 2009, we made decisions that tripled both the number of U.S. troops and the number of civilians, and also changed the focus of those resources to focus on protecting the population and building governance first, when we switched really from a counterterrorism strategy to a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. That's one of the really critical things that changed in 2009, which I think is likely to be seen as the decisive year of the war in Afghanistan, although all of the impact of the decisions made in 2009 have not yet become clear. The other critical decisions made in 2009 happened in Pakistan, when I think Pakistan really began to understand that the Taliban had become an existential threat to itself. And so with the offensives we saw in Swat, in Bunair, and in South Waziristan, we saw the Pakistani government begin to take action against what I believe to be an existential threat to it. That acknowledgement, that fact is not universally acknowledged inside Pakistan, but I think that it is increasingly accepted. And the single determining factor, if there's one factor that determines whether an insurgency succeeds or fails, it is the presence of external sanctuaries. So the fact that Pakistan has decided to begin removing the external sanctuaries has huge implications for the success of our efforts in Afghanistan. And that's one of the major reasons why the Taliban is losing strength in that country. The Taliban is in fact not a particularly popular movement throughout Afghanistan, and not even in the south and the east where it is strongest. Afghanistan-wide, it polls in the low single digits. And the reason, I think, for its low polling data is that the Afghan people have lived under its rule before. They did not like the repressive rules. They did not like the administrative incompetence and malfeasance. The only reason the Taliban is able to survive in the south and in the east is because it's better than nothing. And in fact, it rose up in the absence of any real government in the mid-1990s. It is increasingly under pressure from conventional offensives on both sides of the Durand Line and from drone strikes on both sides of the Durand Line. And so it is having a harder time making a compelling case that it offers a better alternative than the Afghan government. The Afghan government only has to demonstrate that it is better than the Taliban. Unfortunately, it hasn't done that conclusively yet. It is now beginning to improve. It's growing in capability. It has been a poorly resourced effort to support the Afghan government, both in civilian and in military advisors. This effort has been all but shameful for many years. We are now up to a total of some 250,000 Afghan security forces. They vary very widely in quality. We still don't have all of the advisors assigned to Afghan security forces that we say are necessary. And in fact, Secretary Gates recently had to assign a battalion of the 82nd Airborne Division on short-term orders to fill the gap in the advisory capacity. But they are steadily improving. And perhaps most importantly, the Karzai government now has a very clear expression of support from the United States government, and that, I think, is going to affect how President Karzai goes forward. We still have a long way to go. The Karzai government is nowhere near as strong as we would like it to be. That is always a problem in an insurgency. If the government were strong, it wouldn't be facing an insurgency in the first place. But the long-term strategic partnership with the U.S. changes the equation and makes success possible. Any counterinsurgency fight is ultimately a struggle over governance. Outfighting the enemy is just a step. It's a critical step, but it's the first step to allowing governance to take hold. For the first time in the war in Afghanistan, the United States and Pakistan have the right strategy and are beginning to devote sufficient resources to implement that strategy. The Taliban is under great pressure, and the Karzai government is improving, particularly the Afghan army. The Kandahar offensive planned for later this year will remove another safe haven inside Afghanistan and will drive the Taliban further toward reconciliation and reintegration with the Afghan government. And as we've seen just very recently in Iraq, where a coalition of Sunni tribes who were fighting the Iraqi government just 3 years ago appears to have won a plurality in what appears to have been a free and fair election, that's how insurgencies end. When the fighting parties decide that they have more to gain by joining the political fight than by continuing to engage in violence. That is the objective we have to move toward in Afghanistan. It is going to be an effort of many more years, but it is an effort that I believe we can and we must succeed in. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. Let's switch gears to Iraq next. Then we'll come back and have another perspective on Afghanistan. Ken Pollack, again, these are names that you all know. I would remind you that Ken's been at this business for a while, with a baccalaureate from Yale and a PhD from MIT, a stint in the CIA, as a young fellow, a couple of tours in the NSC, now at Brookings. An influential figure in the run-up to the Iraq War, and has been credited with changing a lot of people's minds about whether or not it was a wise thing to do. We'll let him talk about that if he wishes, but I'd like for him to focus on where we are now with Iraq, where we are in withdrawing from Iraq, and what the prospects for a good outcome will be from the United States perspective. Ken?
Thank you, Chuck. You mentioned my prior painful earlier experiences, and I will simply say to all of you, learn a lesson from my misfortune. Be careful what you subtitle. I'd also like very much to add my congratulations to the Nixon Center. Dimitri, Mr. Walker, Justine, well done. The Nixon Center, and I say this as the man from Brookings, has turned out to have made a tremendous contribution to Washington, to our nation, to our national interest. I am delighted to be able to have things to do with you guys from time to time. I am delighted when you call on me to do things with you from time to time, and I am thrilled to be a part of all that you have contributed. So congratulations. It is very well deserved, and I hope that today you hear a great deal of all of the thanks from all of us that you deserve. Now let me turn to Iraq. I'm obviously going to talk a bit about what's been going on in Iraq these last few days, but I think it's important to understand the larger context, to understand why what's going on in Iraq today actually matters, why it means something to all of us, and why it shouldn't just be considered a sideshow, Yes, it's certainly the case that the nation has turned its gaze away from Iraq and back to Afghanistan, and there is a strong argument, an argument, in fact, which I made in the very book that Chuck was alluding to, that we never should have turned our gaze from Afghanistan to Iraq before finishing what we were doing in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, we did so. We took on another challenge in Iraq. We created an even bigger mess in an even more vital part of the world. And as a result, while we may want to diminish our role in Iraq, we cannot dismiss it entirely. Iraq is simply too important. We've made important progress there, but there's still much to be done. And you'll pardon me for using a phrase that has become cliched, the situation in Iraq remains extremely fragile. It's worth keeping in mind that while we tend to talk about Iraq as a counterinsurgency fight, and John, this is not meant as any disrespect to you because I know that you understand what I'm about to say. Iraq was much more than a counterinsurgency fight. Iraq was many things. It was a counterterrorism fight, it was a failed state, it was a nation-building effort, but of greatest importance, it was an intercommunal civil war. There was an insurgency. That insurgency was an important element of it, but it was an insurgency waged by one of the combatants in that intercommunal civil war against the United States and to a certain extent against the government that we had established there. And the really critical fight, the really critical issue is in fact the persistence of that civil war, the underlying features of it. And it's helpful here to think a little bit about the scholarship on civil wars. I mean, this is, after all, what we at think tanks are supposed to do. We're supposed to take the tools of academia and apply them to the problems of policy. And in this case, we actually do have a very extensive, well-developed set of scholarship on civil wars, on how they end, on what the best way is to get them to end in the right way as opposed to the wrong way. And I won't go into too much detail, but it's worth keeping in mind that these kind of intercommunal civil wars have a very, very bad habit of recurring. Okay? The majority of intercommunal civil wars recur within 5 years of some kind of a ceasefire. That's ultimately what we're dealing with in Iraq. We are dealing with a very tender situation, one where the tensions lie just beneath the surface. The militias are down, but they're not out. The anger, the frustration, the fear has subsided, but it's not hard to scratch the surface and reignite it. And all of the different features which have made civil wars recur in places like Congo and Afghanistan and Lebanon and Somalia and all of these other places over the last 100 years, they are all still there, present in spade in Iraq. And that's the problem that we've got to deal with. And again, the scholars have been very good at explaining what needs to happen to deal with those. And it is absolutely possible to snuff out these civil wars, but it takes time. It takes the building of trust among the different parties. It takes a process of national reconciliation where the differences among groups can be sorted out in some kind of a process by law. And in Iraq today, the process of national reconciliation that's ongoing is their politics. Okay? Don't think about Iraq the way that we did South Africa. We're not going to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Iraq whereby everyone comes before it, confesses to their misdeeds, are forgiven, and the country moves forward into Churchill's broad uplands. That ain't going to happen in Iraq. It will be a very messy process of politics. But that process is ongoing. And what's most remarkable is that in the last 2 years, you have seen, perish the thought, the outbreak of democracy in Iraq. Now, it is a very immature democracy, and that democracy is torn at from all sides by the forces that gave rise to the Civil War, points that I made in an article in the National Interest several months ago. But nevertheless, the democratic pressures are there, and they are very powerful, and they are very functional. But the other thing that needs to happen, in addition to this process of politics continuing to move forward, is that we also need to have a functional Iraqi government that is finally able to deliver to its people all of the functions of a state, not just security. That's a critical element, the first element, and the Iraqi state is more or less doing that. But it has to deliver on every other aspect of a reasonable life. It has to create jobs. It has to provide clean water and agriculture. It has to provide a means of living for people. And one of the problems that we face right now that we've not been paying too much attention to, even in the maelstrom of Iraq's political debate, is the incapacity of the Iraqi government to do this. Because while it is absolutely the case that if the Iraqi political process fails, it could resort very quickly to violence taking the place of politics among these competing factions, it is also the case that if the Iraqi government fails to provide on these basic services, the Iraqis will turn to others to do so. And we will see the same problem that has plagued Lebanon in the rise of Hezbollah plague Iraq. It was a problem that we saw in the midst of Iraq's civil war in 2005-2006, and the centrists and others would love to be able to play that role again. So this is the context for the elections. Now, I'm not going to talk too much in detail about the elections, but I do want to hit a few high points about what's going on today, why the elections matter, and where things need to come out, and also the dangers of how they might go awry. First, I think it's important to point out that in many ways the election was a great victory, if you want to use that term, and I'm not terribly happy with that term. I much prefer a step forward for both the United States and Iraq. The elections were, as best anyone can tell, and they've now been validated once again, quite fair and quite free. And what's more, democratic processes, democratic pressures were clearly in action. Candidates ran on records. Candidates ran on promises of delivering to their constituents. And when they ran against each other, the arguments that they were making were about who could best deliver on what it was that their constituents needed. That's all very impressive. And what's more, at the end of the day, while it is certainly true that a large number of Sunnis voted for Iraqiyya and a large number of Shia voted for state of law, it is also the case that Iraqiyya and state of law were the two coalitions, the two political parties out there that were most closely associated in Iraqi minds with secularism, with an end to the sectarian militias, with the democratic process moving forward, and with Iraqi nationalism. And those are all very important statements by the Iraqi people about what it is that they wanted, and very important statements to Iraq's elite about what the Iraqi people want if they are allowed to choose their leadership. But that, of course, is where the rub lies, because there are several dangers remaining. The election is over only in the narrowest sense of having counted the votes. But in Iraq, as in many other parliamentary systems, but particularly in Iraq because of its recent history, the election ain't going to be over for a long time, because we still do not have a government in Iraq, and we certainly don't have a functional government in Iraq. And there is a real risk that all of the great gains, all of the great successes of the election, of the vote itself, could be completely undermined in the process of government formation. And many of the things that we've been seeing in the newspapers recently are all of the problems that could threaten exactly that process. There is the real danger of a stolen election. Many Iraqis right now are very fearful. They see what's going on with Ahmed Chalabi and his control over this Accountability and Justice Commission. They see the efforts by Chalabi and others out there to try to torque the election, to push it in directions that the people never intended, and effectively to steal the election. And they're also very concerned about a perception of complicity on the part of the sitting government to at least allow the AJC to move in this direction, but arguably to even facilitate it. And we've seen decisions by the Iraqi judiciary that have left a great many Iraqis very frightened, that the judiciary is simply going to rubber stamp a series of actions which are clearly illegal and unconstitutional. And if that is the memory that is left of this election, it will set a terrible precedent for Iraq moving forward. It will convince a great many Iraqis, both common and elite, that in fact Iraq's democracy has been subverted. And that moving forward, what matters is not your ability to secure votes in a true democratic fashion, but your ability to steal them or to force people into voting your way, which of course is exactly what happened during the Civil War and which could push Iraq right back in that direction. And it's also worth pointing out that a critical thing that the Iraqis are looking to, in this sense, something that they want to see not happen, is for the United States to simply stand aside and allow the election to be stolen. They are watching us to see whether we step in to prevent it. As much as Iraqis want us to leave, and they all, virtually all, do want us to leave, they are all terrified that we will. They are all terrified that we are simply going to step aside and allow the bad guys, and they all know that the bad guys are out there, and frankly, the vast majority of Iraqis know that all the bad guys are still in the government and running things, and they'd really like to get rid of all of them, but they know that they can't. And what they're afraid of is that the U.S. is going to simply step aside, that we no longer care, that we are so intent on heading for the exits that we're going to allow Iraq's democracy to be subverted and allow the country to descend back into civil war. But by the same token, there is also a real danger of continuing inertia in Iraq. The coalition that has recently been formed among the major Shia parties and the supposition that they're going to bring the Kurds back in would do nothing more than recreate the coalition that has been governing Iraq since 2005. Now, it would be a different coalition. It would be a coalition with Dawa in charge as opposed to ISKI. There would be different personalities, and obviously times have changed. But I think that it is worth asking yourself whether that coalition could somehow do better this time around, especially given that the only real progress it made in the previous 4 years was caused by the United States pushing as hard as it could and by the threat of elections and by the threat that all of these guys were going to have to run on their record. Well, the elections are passed and they're not going to come again for 4 years. And if the United States truly is headed for the door, and it certainly is the case that whatever the administration's intentions, our influence is diminishing, I think that you have to ask yourself the question of whether these two dynamic elements are going to be present to the extent necessary to get that same old coalition to somehow do better this time than it did last time. I would make the case that a much better scenario would actually be for the two big parties, the two parties that will emerge with the most votes, Alawis Iraqiyya, Malikis Dawa, to actually form a new ruling coalition of their own. You could actually see some real dynamism there. It would mean actually excluding some of the groups who have been monkey wrenches in the system. But even there, it's not a perfect system. First, they hate each other. Alawi and Maliki hate each other, and it's very hard to see how they would work together. More than that, it would create a series of other problems, and I won't mention all of them. I'll simply throw one out, which is that doing so would probably require throwing the Kurds out. And you can throw the Kurds out and govern very effectively in Baghdad, but if you throw the Kurds out of the government, Masoud Barzani and the Kurdish regional government are not going to play ball. And part of that process of national reconciliation is, of necessity, the resolution of the differences between the central government and the Kurds. A last point on this is the issue of timing in Iraq and timing here in Washington. As I've suggested, in Iraq, it's going to take a long time to sort all of this out. And I think that at some level, we can give the Iraqis that time. Certainly strategically, there's no reason not to. But what I worry about is our own domestic political calendar. And I worry about how that's going to intersect with the Iraqis. As this process continues to go on, it is almost a certainty that we will continue to see violence in Iraq. The insurgents are out there, they will keep blowing things up. But of greater importance, the longer that this process drags on, the more that militia leaders and other thugs in Iraq will try to create facts on the ground, will try to change the political machinations and move things in their direction through violence. And that could be very problematic for an Obama administration that going into our midterm elections would very much like to show the American people that we are leaving, but we are leaving a peaceful Iraq. And what I fear is that the necessity of being able to square that circle will push the administration to push the Iraqis to form a government fast that won't necessarily be an Iraqi government that can last or that can deliver on all of those services that the Iraqi government needs to deliver on to avert the problems of the Hezbollahization of Iraq and the breakdown of the Iraqi state, which could once again reignite the Iraqi civil war. It's for that reason that we need to keep paying attention to Iraq. There is still reason to be very hopeful about Iraq. There are some very important signs of progress there. But it is a reason to keep our eye very closely trained on Iraq. Iraq is not yet out of the woods. It continues to need a great deal of American, UN, and other country guidance to help it move along, and in particular, to make sure that whenever the bad elements in Iraq raise their heads, try to subvert the system, and use violence again, that there's someone there to play whack-a-mole, to smack them back down, to make sure that we send the message to the Iraqi people and to their other leaders that Iraq is not going to be allowed to return to violence, that everyone is going to have to play by the rules, because as long as they're playing by the rules, Iraq will someday get to the place we'd like it to get to. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Ken. Now we have both wars on the table, and we'll plumb the depths a little bit more now of Afghanistan with Paul Pillar, a 28-year veteran at the CIA, an academic with a couple of degrees, and from Oxford and Dartmouth, a master's and a PhD from Princeton, and the kind of analyst that we all want to have in the CIA, and to provide the kind of analytical work for our policy formulation process that we need. Paul came to our national attention following his time as a national intelligence officer for the Near East and South Asia. In his drawing our attention to the fact that much of the work of the analytical work of the CIA had gone unnoticed or was not taken into consideration in the run-up to Iraq. That's my first awareness of him, and he's been a prominent figure in all of the work that we're doing both in Iraq and in Afghanistan since. We've asked him to dwell principally on prospects in Afghanistan for this, but if he lapses, or particularly in the Q&A period, back into Iraq, well, that'll be all right with me. So, Paul, go ahead.
Thank you, General Boyd, for that generous introduction. I want to echo Ken's comments by way of thanks to the Nixon Center for the invitation to participate in this conference, and congratulations to the Center for all it's accomplished. As noted, I'm on this panel mainly because John and I engaged in a debate in print in the pages of the National Interest about basically, is Afghanistan a war worth fighting? And I will get to that, but I want to begin with a couple of general observations about both these wars, very general. One is that a very large part of the explanation for why we got involved in these wars, the kinds of explanations that historians 50 or 100 years ago are likely to offer, reside in politics back here in the United States, rather than in strategic events overseas. In the case of Iraq, I'm talking about the ascendancy of neoconservatism, the dream that went along with it to use regime change in Iraq as a catalyst for stimulating a remaking of the economics and politics of the Middle East, and along with that, the fact that 9/11, even though it had nothing to do with Iraq, did cause a sea change in American attitudes, generating the very militant public mood which made reaching for that dream politically feasible for the first time. And then in Afghanistan, much of the explanation has to do, to get right down to the political brass tacks, the election of Barack Obama and the history of his treatment of the issue going back to when he was a candidate, when he, to his credit, had been opposed to the Iraq expedition all along. And so Afghanistan became the good war in contrast to the bad war, Iraq, a war that the president declared was a war of necessity. And even though, also to his credit, he had a very deliberative and extended policy review process, the second process, in many ways the outcome was foreordained, that we would be making an effort in Afghanistan that had already been declared as a war of necessity. Hence the surge that's we're undergoing right now. But coupled with, to reassure the American public that this would not be an endless commitment, the decision to start a drawdown, and it's, let's see, just 14 months from now, which, based on everything I've read about counterinsurgency doctrine, isn't nearly enough to do the job. I commend John Nagl, by the way, for what he has written on this subject, which I think evinces a much more realistic view of the time required to do the job, the counterinsurgency job, than is embodied in the policy. My second general point is that discussion of each of these two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, has moved so far beyond the original purposes that we've almost lost sight of those purposes. Discourse has featured often a kind of melange of rationalization, mission creep, relieving of cognitive dissonance, and confusion of means with ends, in which we forget why we were there in the first place. Now, in the case of Iraq, of course, the reason is obvious. We ran into all those difficulties on the ground that caused Iraq not to be a lodestar of political and economic reform for the rest of the region, but rather an example to be avoided. And so we've been reduced to claiming victory with regard to things like the surge and changes of strategy that very conspicuously reduced the level of violence a couple of years ago, even though it did not provide for the kind of political accommodation that the reduction in violence was supposed to lead to. Instead, we've still got the situation that Ken described very vividly, in which political accommodation really has yet to be reached. And in Afghanistan, we hear a lot of talk about social and political order in Afghanistan and what the role might be for different elements if we have a reconciliation process. But you know, the social and political order of Afghanistan never was a vital U.S. interest. It never was something that would justify the kinds of cost and casualties that we are sustaining. We also talk about winning a counterinsurgency, and that's, again, confusing means with ends. Winning a counterinsurgency is not an end in itself. It is a means to something else. Now, there's a lot more that I could say. I'm not going to try to take the time to do it about the prospects for winning. I think there are severe enough doubts about the legitimacy of the government, about our ability to follow up our military success with governance success. You may have seen the piece in the Times by Carlotta Gold yesterday about what's come in the aftermath of our offensive in Marja as one basis for that. But I want to just go back to the question of original purpose. It all started, of course, 9 years ago as a direct response, and a just response, in my view, to 9/11, which was hatched by the group Al-Qaeda that at the time had a close coalition with the Afghan Taliban. Now, all that's changed, of course, in response to a large degree to our military success in the very opening months of Operation Enduring Freedom. Al-Qaeda isn't in Afghanistan anymore, except for a handful of people. But in any case, the point is, it's all about terrorism, or it's supposed to be all about terrorism. And I'm coming at this, by the way, not as an Iraq guy or an Afghanistan guy, but as an old counterterrorist guy. The question is, are the things that we're doing there making Americans safer from terrorist threats? And it's even more precise than that. It's not, is it making it safer? Is it making us enough safer? Is it reducing the terrorist threat enough from what it otherwise would be to justify the costs and casualties? That's the question that has to be in the forefront when we talk about why we are there and where we go from here. Let me make some observations that are pertinent to that question. I already made the first one. Al-Qaeda isn't in Afghanistan. That's not a safe haven. Although the President has made quite clear that the main objective is to prevent the reestablishment of a terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan. Well, as far as Al-Qaeda Central is concerned, they've already got one in Pakistan on the other side of the Durand Line. And if they didn't have that, there would be other opportunities elsewhere, the Yemens, the Somalias, elsewhere. And even more fundamentally is the issue of how important a territorial safe haven of any sort is to the operations of and the threat posed by a terrorist group, be it Al-Qaeda Central or any other. And the fact is, it is not one of the more important things that determines the degree of threat that any group poses. Now, let me make it clear what I'm saying. The question is not, does a terrorist group welcome having a safe haven if it's got one available? Yes, it does. Does it make good use of it? Yes, it does. The question is, does it increase the threat that the group poses to such a degree that the costs and casualties required to preclude such a safe haven are justifiable? And there I think the answer is no. So we're fighting a kind of surrogate enemy in Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban. It's not a transnational terrorist group. Its objectives are not bin Laden's objectives. It is one of the most insular bunches of people you're going to find anywhere. The Taliban are concerned with the social and political order inside Afghanistan. They don't really care about us except insofar as we are mucking into the issue of the social and political order of Afghanistan. Even if the Taliban did reestablish power over much of Afghanistan, as it did prior to the initiation of Operation Enduring Freedom, it would not be likely to welcome back al-Qaeda into the kind of alliance or relationship and hospitality that existed prior to the fall of 2001. The Taliban remember that the biggest setback they have ever suffered, namely Operation Enduring Freedom, was a direct result of what bin Laden's group did. And by the way, given that bin Laden and Zawahiri seem to be comfortably ensconced somewhere over there in North Waziristan on the other side of the Durand Line, I think it's doubtful also that they would try to move back onto the northwestern side of the line if given the opportunity. Oh, and by the way, if they did try to establish anything like what was present there prior to the fall of 2001, the ground rules, of course, as far as application of U.S. military force are concerned, have changed drastically. Long gone are the days when President Clinton ordered a cruise missile strike against one of those camps in 1998 and was accused, even though we had just had 2 of our embassies attacked, of trying to divert attention from a White House sex scandal. Now everybody knows, bin Laden and the Taliban and everyone else, if anything like Zawahiri camp tried to be reestablished, we'd bomb the heck out of it without hesitation and with firm U.S. public support. Meanwhile, we're making enemies of our own inside Afghanistan. John was quite correct in noting that the Taliban isn't all that popular. It's not popular at all. And many of the people who have taken up arms against our coalition have no sympathy at all for the radical Islamist ideology of the Taliban. They are motivated by a couple of things. One, a foreign military occupation, or so they see it. And two, the collateral damage and casualties that are an inevitable part of even the most carefully conceived and executed military operations. And I think our military is doing its best to carefully conceive and execute its operations. I don't see how any of this is making Americans safer. So let me close on this point. I see some very admirable, typically American traits in how we're approaching Afghanistan. Notably, the trait of seeing something through to a successful conclusion once we've undertaken it. A determination to win rather than lose. That's admirable. That's the kind of determination that has helped us win other wars, including some really big ones like World War II. But we need to resist the tendency to treat something like a counterinsurgency as an end when it's really only a means. And we need to resist the tendency, all too common and human, to treat sunken costs as some kind of investment. Although it's not psychologically as comfortable, we need to take a hard-headed, realist view toward cost and benefits and ask ourselves to what extent what we're doing in Afghanistan does reduce the terrorist threat to Americans, and is it worth the cost? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. There's Christopher later on in this session, questions and challenges. But now I want to hear from the one member of the panel who is not a great academic, steeped in Middle East and Iraq and Afghanistan and various other aspects of the Middle East, but and not with all those fancy degrees. Joe went to Penn, which has been described as the trailer park of the Ivy League. I can say that because I went to KU, which is the tractor park of the... But what Joe brings to the table is a fresh look. And I was kind of with him in the beginning of his interest in Iraq, and watched him develop, and he's like a terrier dog. He gets into something and he grabs a hold of it and he won't let go. And he comes up with a perspective that you're not likely to hear elsewhere. That doesn't make it right or wrong. It means that he's interesting, and so he's written for just about every kind of a publication you could think of. This is a guy who is self-described scribbler. He was one of the most prominent writers for the Peabody Times, I think.
Yes.
And Rolling Stone, as well as the New Yorker and Time Magazine, obviously, New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth. I'm very interested in, I have no idea where he's going. I asked him today, to talk about Afghanistan, and I talked some about Iraq. But who knows? With Joe Klein, you never know where he's going to go, but always he will be interesting, and I expect he will be today.
Thanks, Chuck. Given that introduction, I'm sure that you're all asking yourselves the Stockdale question. Who is this guy? What is he doing here? And you're right to ask it. By the way, I was not only not an academic, I was a lousy student at Penn. I was class of '68, and there were other things happening, you know? I didn't start really becoming a student until I began doing it for myself rather than having others attempt to do it to me. But I guess the most basic reason why I'm here and why Chuck has asked me to be here is September 11th, 2001. I live in a small town just north of New York City, and on that evening, 9 of my neighbors didn't come home. And the widows, several of the widows said to me, "Joe, you do this for a living. We have little kids. When they get older, can you explain to them why their fathers died?" So I decided I was on a mission. I had to learn the U.S. military. I had to learn I knew the region some, but I had to learn it a lot better. I had to learn intelligence a lot better, and I had to learn Islam a lot better. And from that day to this, I've spent as much of my time as I possibly could doing it. And in addition to thanking the Nixon Center, I'd like to thank several of the members of this panel for being my guides along the way. Chuck Boyd, absolutely a total mentor. You know, I wouldn't be sitting here today if it weren't for Chuck. Ken Pollack on Iraq, about which we've argued more than once, and also on Iran, which is a country that I've visited twice in the last 10 years, including the election last summer. And John Nagl, who gave me untold grief if I didn't read all the stuff that Petraeus put on the reading list for me to learn about counterinsurgency. I remember he once told me that I was so stupid that he was amazed that I could get up and tie my shoes in the morning. And I said to him, "John, I wear loafers." And he said, "Exactly." But I have been able to, during these last 9 years, to watch something absolutely remarkable in the history of the American military. And it's amazing to me that nobody's really mentioned it, which has been the transformation of the United States Army from an organization built to fight tank battles on the plains of Europe and also the desert of Iraq into what Admiral Mike Mullen has called the greatest counterinsurgency force in the world. That took an awful lot of doing, and it took an awful lot of transformation. And if I were going to do the usual journalist thing, I would say, well, you know, the counterinsurgency strategy won in Iraq, and now it's being tried in Afghanistan under different circumstances, and the question is whether it'll win there. But I'm not a docile pupil, and I have some real questions, growing questions about counterinsurgency as a strategy. And I have some real and growing questions, as we all should, about what happened in Iraq and what's happening in Afghanistan now. Now, I've been a big supporter and fan of counterinsurgency. I've written about it for the last 6 years. And I've seen it work in places. And I think that it played a role in what happened in Iraq. It's certainly the joint security stations that were established in 2007 in places like Baghdad, Ramadi, and Fallujah, where U.S. and Iraqi forces worked side by side in what is known in the States as community policing, certainly had a role in quieting down Baghdad and also a role in quieting down some of the other larger cities. It worked better in urban areas than in rural districts. But there were other things that were going on in Iraq at the same time, and I think it's too soon for us to evaluate the relative importance of each. One thing that was going on was, a more cosmic thing, is that as violent and almost gratuitously violent as the Iraqis can be, they were getting pretty tired of fighting by 2007. And so there was a general willingness to consider other options. Secondly, and I give George W. Bush, for whom I have minimum high regard in almost every other area, I give him great credit for this. The redoubling and re-emphasis on human intelligence that came as a consequence of 9/11 was beginning to pay dividends in Iraq by 2007. And the great untold story of that effort was the success of the Special Operations Forces, led by Stanley McChrystal. That had a great deal to do with breaking the back of the insurgency. It wasn't just community policing that did it. And the third thing that was significant, and this really does relate to what's happening in Afghanistan now, was what happened in Anbar province, the heartland of the Sunni insurgency. Early on, the Anbari Sunnis accepted an offer from Al-Qaeda and from foreign fighters. We'll fight the Americans for you. We'll fight them with you. We'll get rid of these invaders. Sounded pretty good. They took the deal, but over time they realized that there were three codicils that they didn't like so much. Number one, you can't smoke. Number two, you can't watch TV. You can't even watch the Iraqi national soccer team on TV. And number three, we want your daughters. Literally, it was the case. Several Sunni chiefs were beheaded, as a result of their resistance to these rules. David Petraeus was smart enough to come in with a counteroffer. You can smoke, you can watch TV, we're not interested in your daughters, and we'll pay you cash money. All of these factors brought together, I think, contributed to the success that we saw, the success of the so-called surge in 2007, 2008. Now, to me, there's an interesting link between the two of those, and it's a battalion that I was embedded with in Afghanistan last month, the 112 of the 4th Infantry. And I was talking to a sergeant who had done several rotations with this unit. They were deployed, I was with them, in an area just outside of Kandahar, the heartland of the Taliban, Jari district, 80% controlled by the Taliban at this point. Mullah Omar's hometown is a couple of towns over from where I was in Sanjare. And this First Sergeant Robinson said to me, God, our last deployment in Ramadi was so satisfying. We really got to clean that place up. We were deployed in joint security stations. We saw the place change during the course of the last year, of our year there. This deployment has been far more frustrating far more impossible. We haven't made any progress at all. In fact, we're regressing. We haven't gotten any support from the Afghan government. We haven't had a civilian surge, the vaunted civilian surge from the State Department. USAID came into Sanjare for 2 days and said, we can't do it here. And there were no foreign fighters to dispose of. You know, the fighters were all indigenous neighbors of theirs, Taliban. And in fact, when this unit, captain of this unit, Jeremiah Ellis, a remarkable young American soldier, offered them an irrigation canal restoration program, the leaders of the town secretly went across the border to Quetta, asked the Taliban, can we go ahead with this? It'll be a good thing to have after the Americans leave. And the Taliban said, sure, if you pay us 50% of the money that are going to go to the Afghan workers. So the situation in Afghanistan, I think, which is too often compared, especially by my colleagues in the press, to the situation in Iraq. And the counterinsurgency strategy, which was partially successful, partially accountable for the success in Iraq, is facing a much different challenge here. There are a couple of other problems, or a couple of other points I'd make about the current situation in Afghanistan. Excuse me, you get them mixed up, Iraq, Afghanistan. I disagree with John some about the coherence of the strategy. When I was at Fort Leavenworth, sitting at the knee of General Petraeus and your colleagues there, I learned a number of things about how counterinsurgency works. And the key thing was that it was about securing the population rather than doing kinetic operations against an enemy. And in Afghanistan, there has been a very, very sloppy application of counterinsurgency strategy. Part of it is that it's a holdover from the previous military command. David McKiernan is a fine man and an excellent general, but he was pursuing a strategy of going after the bad guys in Helmand province rather than protecting the center of gravity, the most important population center, which was in Kandahar province. And in fact, when McChrystal came in last summer, one of the first questions he asked in his strategy session is, what are we doing in Helmand province? Well, you know, I've come to love our warrior intellectuals, but sometimes the warrior part gets the better of the intellectual part, and in this case, Stan McChrystal saw 200 Taliban or 300 Taliban fighters in the town of Marja and decided to go whack them and provide government a box. And in doing so, I see Doyle McManus out there. Doyle and I were in Marja together in late March. And I don't know, how many of you know exactly what government in a box turned out to be in the town of Marja? Do you know how many Afghan government officials actually spend the night there? 6. That's as of last night. Check that out. At the same time, what the Marja operation did was to pull Afghan troops, important Afghan army troops, away from Kandahar province. The Kandak, which is the Afghan name for a regiment, that was supposed to be in Jari district, where I was sent to fight in Marja. They're not back yet. There are 600 ANCOPs, that's probably the most proficient version of police officers in Afghanistan. There are 600 ANCOPs in Marja. They're not in Kandahar province. And and they're obviously going to be needed there. And as Paul Pillar mentioned just before, Carlotta Gall's story yesterday in the New York Times indicates that what we're back to doing is the exact thing that David Petraeus and the other people who supported counterinsurgency supported counterinsurgency in Iraq were trying to counteract, which is we're now engaged in a game of whack-a-mole in Helmand province, which is taking away the kind of coherence and focus on Kandahar, which will be necessary if counterinsurgency is going to work there. The other really striking thing about this is that if you go to the Yellow Building, ISAF headquarters in Afghanistan, and you talk to Stan McChrystal and his generals, they are wildly, wildly optimistic about what's happening in Afghanistan. It's very much at variance with what you see on the ground. And there's a reason for it. I mean, these are smart guys and very sophisticated guys. The reason why they're so wildly optimistic is because the special operations part of this operation, a part of this war, is going swimmingly. It's going brilliantly. Again, the increased human intelligence on both sides of the Pakistan border has been yielding really spectacular results. Unfortunately, those results aren't permanent. The Taliban has an ability to replace the middle-level leaders that are being whacked on a nightly basis. And it is on a nightly basis. And it's been tremendously successful. But it has led, I think, to a certain delusional quality on the part of our military, who see this tremendous success and see the enemy being degraded significantly, but aren't out in places like Sanjare, where I was, where the local Afghan representative, the district governor, is living on the American base, doesn't have the courage to actually live out among his people, and there are no government services being provided. And so I have great fears about and great doubts about what's happening in Afghanistan now. I have great doubts about what's going to happen in Kandahar this summer. I can throw in something about the McChrystal rules of engagement, which I believe in theory, in principle, but in practice, on the ground, the regular troops, not the special ops troops, have been finding them very, very restrictive and difficult to operate under. And as a result, they've been pulling back from confrontations with the Taliban. Now, Ken mentioned the importance of national reconciliation in Iraq. And I would argue that national reconciliation is the only possible answer in Afghanistan. It doesn't mean, I don't think that there's much chance that the Taliban are going to take over. This is another civil war between Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. But I do believe that the Taliban, as unpopular as they are throughout the country, are probably the only people who their acquiescence is going to be necessary for governance, for successful governance to take place in the Pashtun areas like Kandahar and Helmand provinces. I expect that, from what I understand from last week's meetings, there was some movement on our part to give Karzai a freer hand, something he really wants in attempting to reconcile, especially with the Quetta Shura Taliban. But we're still resisting it, and the military in particular is resisting it on the grounds that we can make a better deal, logical grounds we can make a better deal with the Taliban after we whack them some more. But I point out this, and to close, I'll tell you a couple of stories. and it goes back to what Secretary Schlesinger said before about what's happened over the last 8 or 9 years. And we really can't deal with these wars, as Paul said, in isolation from the political circumstances and the wild, naive arrogance that informed U.S. behavior, the behavior of the last administration. John knows this story. In the fall of 2003, in fact, you may have been one of my sources for this. In the fall of 2003,
Never met the guy.
several U.S. military intelligence officers went to Jerry Bremer and said, hey, we can buy 19 Dulemi sub-tribes out in Anbar province. You remember this? We'll give them little uniforms, maybe they'll have sidearms, we'll give them weapons training, we'll pay them. They say they'll watch the border for us. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but at least we'll have a leg up. And they were told by Jerry Bremer, or maybe was it Megan O'Sullivan, but they were told by the Coalition Provisional Authority the following: tribes are part of the past. They have no future in the new democratic Iraq. I'll tell you one other story. In December of 2001, Mullah Omar rode by bicycle from Kandahar city to his hometown of Sangasar, which is in Jari district. And he was utterly defeated at that point. And Hamid Karzai is never more than a phone call away from Mullah Omar. And what he did then was to send an emissary, known to both of them, a fellow by the name of Nakibullah, down to Sangasar, and said, look, if you'll lay down your arms and renounce al-Qaeda, I'll bring you into the government. Mullah Omar said yes. Donald Rumsfeld said no. And so my final point here is, tell you another story. I'm walking into a TV station a few years into this, and Bill Kristol is walking out and he says to me, Joe, you've become such a realist, as if that were a term of opprobrium. And I guess I have. And I guess the reality in both these countries is that we are dealing, and we have to appreciate the tribal structures, the ethnic rivalries, and that now that we've gotten into them, we owe a certain responsibility to the people who are there, who have made a commitment to us. And the best way to meet that commitment, I think, is by trying to figure out how we can best enable them to do what they'd naturally be doing, rather than trying to impose our vision of what they should be doing from above. And the very last point I'd make is this, that with the tremendous improvements in human intelligence, I think that it's our physical presence, our massive presence, our counterinsurgency presence on the ground in Afghanistan is becoming less necessary, and in the region as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. And before I turn it over to the general audience for questions, let me just ask one of my own. 3 of the 4 speakers have emphasized the element of time, and indeed, the fatigue level in these circumstances always matters. My own personal experience in my war was the Vietnam War. My involvement in that war spanned 12 years. The fatigue level, my own fatigue level got pretty high before that 12 years was over, and certainly that of the American people. We lost the center through fatigue and lost the war as a result. Fatigue level is high. Obama's election bought some time for Afghanistan, but it didn't buy an awful lot, I don't think. I'm going to start, Joe, because you've got a political sense that over the years has really been remarkable, I think. How much time give us some kind of an answer. How much time do you think we really have? Assuming, although we start a withdrawal in mid-2011, we don't know when the end of that will be. That will largely depend upon how much stomach the American people have. What's your estimate? What's your guess?
Well, it's hard to guess because that is, their stomach for that is going to be a function of, how they perceive things are going in this country, especially the economy. But I would be, I would be very wary about the use of July 2011 as this remarkable bright line date. First of all, the most important date that's coming up is the policy review that will happen next December in the Obama administration. And they're going to judge, and the timetable for these events in Afghanistan this year, we're absolutely precisely calibrated to meet that deadline. The Marja campaign, about which I've expressed so much skepticism, the Kandahar campaign, and the training of Afghan troops, about which I can express even more skepticism. Depending on how these things go, the president is going to look in December about whether he wants to stay or whether he wants to really activate that July 2011 date. What may well happen, if there's significant progress over the summer, and I never put significant progress out of the equation when we're dealing with the U.S. military, which always meets and exceeds, the expectations, the very high expectations I've come to have them. But, if things are going relatively well, July 2011 becomes the date that the Germans pull out of Mazar-e-Sharif, and we proceed from there. Maybe the Italians go; they'll really be missed. But I do think that there is a significant difference between the politicians' timetable, the public's timetable, and the military's timetable. John will tell you, and counterinsurgency advocates, when they're honest, will tell you that you need at least 10 years. And I would say that in the case of Afghanistan, that's wildly optimistic because you don't have a government that can provide the services that you need. So I would say it may not be, Chuck, it may not be July 2011. It may take be a couple of years longer than that, but not much more longer than that. And I hope that there's a reconciliation deal before that.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that before we throw it out to the general audience? John.
I've been, with great respect for the Vietnam generation, the lessons of Vietnam don't apply particularly well in this particular case, I don't think, in this particular part of the case in terms of public support, because we have an all-volunteer military, and that has frankly changed everything. And as I talk to my journalist friends, one of the things that they keep telling me is that they cannot get the American people interested in Afghanistan. That it is regularly page 24 news, that what the American people care about is oil spills, they care about the American economy. As long as the American military, and in particular the Army, remains committed to the fight, continues to hold up under the strain, and as long as they think we're making progress, and as long as they think the war is being fought for a just cause, is in the national interest, the American people will, I think, continue to support the fight as long as those conditions remain. I would agree with Joe. I really think that the counterinsurgency campaign, we say that we've been fighting in Afghanistan for 8 years, 9 years. Honestly, the real fight, the counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan started in 2009. And I see a substantial American presence for somewhere between 5 and 10 years, increasingly in an advisory role.
Paul, do you agree with that?
With regard to the difference that conscription makes, John's absolutely right. That's a big difference. I would just note that President Nixon had the political wisdom to stop sending conscripts to Vietnam at least about a year before the war was over. I have little to add to what Joe mentioned. I think the July 2011 date is going to be firm with regard to the initiation of a withdrawal. I find it hard to conceive that the administration will back down from that. But beyond that, to predict the pace or the length of it, as Joe correctly says, it's going to depend on a host of political and economic factors back here in the United States, most of which don't have direct bearing on the war, but will have a direct bearing on the limits of U.S. patience. And finally, on John's comment about where do we effectively start the clock, you're right in terms of counterinsurgency doctrine being fully implemented in the sense that you're talking about, John, but in terms of American public perceptions, I'm not sure the American people would see it that way. One thing they see and they know is we've been there almost 9 years already. So that's the effective start of the clock.
Ken.
I just want to add one point, Chuck, on Iraq and Afghanistan and how to tell them apart. I think it's important because it gets this issue of time, and Joe mentioned it, which is I am a little bit nervous that part of the time frame that the administration set for itself was being drawn from Iraq, and I think that's a very dangerous false analogy. Iraq was, as I said before, a lot of different wars, but it was primarily an intercommunal civil war. Now, we talk about COIN because that's the term that the military is familiar with. That's what it's comfortable. It's because that whole school of warfare, which is really low-intensity conflict, was driven largely by our experience most recently in Vietnam. But obviously, there are precedents for it as well. We did apply counterinsurgency in Iraq, but it was only part of what we applied. And in fact, most of what we were doing really was from that broader family of low-intensity conflict. And again, this is not a contradiction of John. John knows this full well. And his book lays this out very nicely. I remember a conversation that Joe and I had where we were talking about this and we're talking about the term. I said, don't worry about the term. What they're doing in Iraq is the right thing. It's not, COIN is only part of it, but don't worry, they're doing the right thing. They know exactly what they're doing. It's fine. What they're really doing is low-intensity conflict, and it doesn't really matter because in low-intensity conflict, the first 10 steps are always the same. Okay? Whether it's counterterrorism or counterinsurgency or dealing with a civil war, the first 10 steps are always the same. And at some point in time, Joe came to me and said, okay, what's the 11th step? And then, and that is where it is interesting because there are some very important differences between dealing with a civil war versus dealing with an insurgency. But the important thing to understand here is if you use proper low-intensity conflict tactics, you can shut down a civil war really fast. And that's what happened in Iraq. Okay? And Joe is right that there were about a dozen different things that happened in Iraq, but underpinning every single one of them was the change in our strategy and tactics and the adoption of low-intensity conflict measures, and that's why we were able to shut down the Iraqi civil war so quickly. Now, it doesn't mean the war is solved. That was the point that I was trying to make. You then have to deal with the political problems. That takes longer. In Afghanistan, and I am not the Afghan expert that these gentlemen are, but in Afghanistan, my strong sense is that it is a much more traditional insurgency. And in that respect, it is very different from Iraq. And as John has pointed out, as Joe has pointed out, successful counterinsurgency campaigns typically take 9 years. Okay? So we should not assume that what happened in Iraq is a good model for what's going to happen in Afghanistan. It's not. They're very different wars.
All right, let's open it up. We have mics on the side. Please use those and identify yourself, if you will, at the beginning. Arnold?
Arnold de Borgraf, CSIS. If you go back to Vietnam, on March 29th, 1973, the last U.S. soldier left Vietnam. But Saigon didn't fall until April of 75. What happened, of course, was that Congress yanked the rug right from under our South Vietnamese allies. And my question is, what does a long-term commitment from President Obama to President Karzai mean in the context of how our government functions?
Who wants to start with that one? Paul? John, all right.
Go ahead, John. I was just going to say that it entirely depends on the quality of governance that the Karzai government provides. I mean, if they begin to step up something about which I have grave doubts, then the commitment will, then they'll be able to govern, and we'll be happy to help them.
I think that the administration continues to struggle with this inside itself. I think that there is a significant wing of the administration that continues to believe that counterterrorism is an acceptable substitute for a counterinsurgency strategy, and the problem with that, the single biggest problem I have with that, is that counterterrorism strategy doesn't change the conditions that allow the terrorists to emerge. So it truly is war without end. Counterinsurgencies take a long time but change the conditions. The American security commitment to Afghanistan, I believe, is going to be like the American security commitment to Iraq, which is also going to be in the 5-10 year. I see long-term security commitments in both places. I see those moving to advisory efforts. Certainly Iraq is currently procuring, has signed a contract to buy M1A1 tanks, is working to buy F-16 fighter planes. That's going to be a long-term relationship with, I think, long-term benefits, mutual benefits to Iraq, to the United States, and to the region. In Afghanistan, I also think there's going to be a long-term security commitment. I don't think we'll be selling them that kind of hardware anytime soon, but I do think there's going to be a long tail to the American relationship.
As someone who was on that last plane on March 29th, 1973, I think some of the lesson of Vietnam still obtains, and it's related to General Boyd's previous question. Once the U.S. military mission is accomplished, and it will be described as accomplished regardless of what the specific situation is, when our own troops are out of there, there will be a great reduction in American public concern about and interest in Afghanistan, and I think there is a real issue about whether there will be sufficient public support for whether it's economic aid or diplomatic chits being used for the follow-on mission, if you want to describe it that way. So your question is really an extension of Chuck Boyd's.
Harlan?
I'm Harlan Ullman. I'd like to go back to the issue of Vietnam in the sense that it took a long time for the government to realize what was happening. There seems to be a huge divide that I'd like to have somebody explain between the administration and certainly last week's Karzai show and reports coming out of Afghanistan. Joe Klein, I think, is representative of the majority, if not the universality, of reporting. Discussions one has with colonels, majors, and sergeants, reports from other intelligence communities and very senior officers in other militaries. You hear the words like catastrophe and disaster. Yet the White House seems to be pretty positive, and I suspect it has to be more than just what's happening in special operations, because there are still adults in the administration who are going to take a harder look and, I think, try to get to the bottom. So how do you explain the big divide between the optimism of the administration politically and what many of us believe are the realities of the ground in Afghanistan, which I think are going south and not in the right direction?
You want to start with that, John?
I can, and Joe's been on the ground more recently than I have, but Harlan, I'm getting rather different reports. I'm seeing an Afghan security force that is getting better from a very low base. Afghan army better than police. Huge problems with Afghan governance, which I think is incredibly important, but increasing signs of Taliban desires to reconcile, great interest in the Taliban, in what the peace jirga is going to amount to, whether the Karzai administration is really going to provide bridges, and some reasonable clear-headedness. And it's interesting hearing Joe talk about this. Journalists, of course, the reason they're such good dinner partners, they're inherently skeptical and cynical and very, very bitter, angry people. Where the military is I think correctly, I think Joe didn't use the word Pollyannish, but does tend to see the glass as half full. But it would be a wonderful thing if we could embed some of the journalists then with the Taliban. And I mean that in the nicest possible way. Because it would be wonderful to bring that perspective to bear on what the Taliban is going through right now. And so journalists, by their nature, and because it tells it's a story, is going to focus on the negative, and there's lots of negative, and these are long, hard, slow wars, and I don't recommend them to anybody. Right? This is not the way we should fight, but this is how our enemies are choosing to fight us. But I think the Taliban is also under a great deal of pressure, and we just don't get very good reporting in the open press on what's happening there. And I think you have to factor that into the discussion.
Well, John, there's a reason for that. You know, the military isn't going to tell us about their special ops. I mean, I would love to be able to embed with, with a special ops group dealing with Taliban mid-level leaders on a night-to-night basis, but military ain't going to let me go there. And by the way, there have been journalists who have embedded with the Taliban. They haven't seen the hardships, and I agree with you that those are very real. Harlan, I disagree. I don't think it's going south. It's just not going north. And when an insurgency, a war against an asymmetric war, isn't going north, it is going south a little. And as for the happy talk from the administration, they have to do that. They have to make nice with Karzai. And talk about the tremendous progress that was made in all these meetings with ministry officials last week. But I can guarantee you, in my conversations with people in the administration who have authority on this issue, there is an increasing dismay and skepticism about the progress of this war.
Okay, all right. Fourth row back on the inside. You, sir.
Thank you. Wayne Mary, and I regret being the third person to refer back to the Vietnam thing, but it does reflect perhaps our generation. Look, the good news certainly is that we don't have a Walter Cronkite announcing 350 American killed every Friday. But the bad news, it seems to me, is with two wars going, the proportion of American households, American communities that are in any way really touched by these conflicts is the lowest since any American conflict since the war with Spain. And the average American nowadays may be more likely on a daily basis to see this war in Doonesbury than anything else. Their contact with this war is more likely to be on the comic page than the front page. And let me just put it to you that for the long-term relationship of the American Republic to its army, that is not a good thing.
If John won't talk about his mom, I will. I remember John once. John once said to me that his mom called him up and said, "Why isn't the government encouraging us to be part of this the way the government did in World War II? When there were scrap drives and all the rest. We don't need scrap drives now, but." Funding programs like Greg Mortenson's schools program and so on should be, every single time I see a president of the United States stand up with guys in the military behind him, he's talking about what they're about to do and he's trying to establish his closeness to them. What he should be doing is saying to the American people, see these guys behind me? They're going out to do serious business on your behalf. What are you going to do to help them? How are you going to involve yourself in this? And I was tremendously disappointed in Obama's West Point speech about Afghanistan because he never even mentioned that.
Just quickly, no, God bless her. I came back from Desert Storm and was overwhelmed by the reaction I received from the American people, and I lost friends in that fight. But most of us who were in that campaign will tell you that we had harder field problems at the National Training Center than we did the actual fight at in Iraq. And the response of the American people, I think, was a delayed understanding of the way they treated the Vietnam generation. And being in uniform for the first 5 or 6 years, 7 years of the current war, I was astounded by the support of the American people. You literally had to leave extra time if you were flying in uniform because you couldn't make it through the airport, people stopping you, shaking your hand, thanking you. I can't tell you the number of meals and beers that I went to pay for in airports, in restaurants, and the waiter would tell me some American already paid for it to say thanks. So I agree with you. I agree with Joe. 2 administrations now have done a horrible job of harnessing the genuine desire of the American people to thank this generation of volunteers. And I would say that Gary Trudeau has been one of the most effective spokesmen for a number of issues. He's working sexual harassment in the military now, PTSD, the silent wounds that this generation is suffering, and the world would be a better place if there were more of that. So thanks for bringing it up.
Just quickly, it is a wonderful thing that we have belatedly come to appreciate what our military servicemen and women have done. When I got back from Vietnam, I didn't get any free meals or drinks or anything in the airport. But the question is related to a larger pattern, and this is in turn related perhaps to the fact that we don't have conscription anymore, of division in views and outlooks between those who have worn the uniform and the much larger proportion of the American population who have not. You know, there has been sociological research on this, documenting the division of perspectives that has gotten ever wider. And this is reflected in turn in things like the fact that the U.S. Congress has far fewer military veterans than it did at one time. This has consequences of various sorts we don't have time to fully explore, but your question, I think, is related to that.
You, sir, right here. 3rd row, back.
Thank you very much. Norman Bailey, Institute of World Politics. I'd like to go back for a moment to the question that Arnaud de Borgrave asked, and which in my opinion was not appropriately answered by any member of the panel. Given the fiscal train wreck which this country is hurtling towards, anyone who thinks that any promise made to Afghanistan and Iraq will be honored by the American Congress is using the principal export commodity of Afghanistan. There is not only will those promises not be honored, the American military will see substantial reductions in their resources.
Marvin Kalb. I am trying to get some enlightenment about the actual strength of the Afghan military and police force. I think it was John who mentioned 250,000 for the total security force. Last week, Karzai said at a meeting at USIP that 250,000 was the aspirational number. And then I think the defense minister corrected him and said something about 275. Do you all know, or do you have any sense right now, what is the strength of the Afghan army, police, and then how much time do you need in Afghanistan to get it up to a certain number that would be required to achieve whatever you want to call it, victory or something? How long does that take, and what is that number?
Do you have the actual numbers, John? I don't have the.
I was briefed on it yesterday.
I don't have the actual numbers, but there are a couple of matters of real concern. Once you add, there are fairly impressive numbers on the ground now, but the attrition rates are significant. In the very best Afghan police program, ANCOP, the attrition rate, the desertion rate is 75%. And among the other police forces, who are in many ways the most important players here, Doyle and I were in Marja when we saw Admiral Mullen do a shura with a group of local leaders whose main demand was that they not bring back the Afghan cops into town because they were all corrupt. And I think that I've been trying to get the Army to disaggregate the desertion rates for Afghan National Army units that are actually performing in combat areas, and I haven't been able to get them to do it.
We're going to have one more question, I think.
Yeah, John, you got the number?
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I don't have good numbers. I mean, they're available, and I can get them to you, Marvin. But the total number, Army and police, right now is order of magnitude of 250. The right answer is probably double that. Historically, according to historical counterinsurgency ratios, about 500,000 total security forces to secure Afghanistan against an insurgency, given its population, with roughly 150,000 internationals. And those 250,000 Afghans, if they were better, would have a very good chance of doing this. The error we made in failing to start building an Afghan security force, and we didn't really start putting real resources against the effort until November of 2009, when we put a 3-star general in charge of the effort, Bill Caldwell, probably the most talented 3-star in the military today. We put a 3-star in charge of that effort in Iraq in 2004. We're roughly 5 years behind where we ought to be in terms of building Afghan security forces. And so that's a 10-year effort to build an Afghan security force that can secure the country on its own. There's going to be a decreasing number of American advisors required to do that in conjunction with a continued American Special Operations Forces presence to continue to do some of the counterterrorism stuff over the 5 to 10-year period.
One last question, right back here.
I'm Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. Have we misunderstood the nature of modern war? When we got into these wars, Iraq especially, the idea was it's a cakewalk, mission accomplished. When the insurgency first started, President Bush said, bring them on, we're plenty tough. I think back to Napoleon. He was able to beat the armies, but he couldn't handle the insurgency in Spain. He made it to Moscow. But if the people don't want occupation, then what do you do? Is this a problem of nationalism? Can you defeat this with firepower? And since Vietnam was invoked, during Vietnam, we were able to deploy 500,000 in the field. Now 200,000 is the maximum. What can you do if you are in an era of nationalism, wars of nationalism, and all you can deploy in the field is 200,000? Can you substitute firepower for manpower? If not, where does that leave you in terms of your commitments and what you can do?
This gentleman right here brought up what's been the elephant in the room all along, and we don't like to think about it, I'm sure, but it is a fact that the weight of this enormous debt that our nation has now incurred will play a significant role in how long we can keep the American people engaged and in support of this war. By the CBO's own figures, our debt will be at 20 trillion. By the end of this decade, we'll be borrowing $1 trillion a year to service that debt. There is no question but what we're going to have great cuts in our commitment to the Department of Defense and to our military, long before the end of the decade. So that, as the American people come into full consciousness of that, it's certainly, I believe, going to affect us. Did you want to add something on that?
Just in response to the last questioner, I think your question puts your finger on a very important dimension that, yes, there are inherent limits to what we can accomplish with military force. In the short term, some use of personnel and firepower can substitute for other ways to counter these nationalist impulses. But again, to refer one last time to Vietnam, we got up to 540,000 troops, and that wasn't enough. So never mind 200,000. You are quite correct that the nationalist impulses that we are seeing very strongly in Afghanistan, as well as in other places, set inherent limits on how we can pursue our national interest through military force.
Could I just say that, and this runs a little bit counter to the thrust of my remarks. And I was in Baghdad in June of 2007 and at a joint security station where Americans and Iraqi police served together, patrolled a neighborhood. And there was a young American woman from Iowa whose life had been saved by one of the Iraqis. And she, the soldier, this American soldier, took me over to the guy to introduce me to him. And he began to talk about what he was learning from the Americans, about how to police this neighborhood. And I would say that to just throw our hands up in the air and say there's nothing we can do is as wrong as the wildly naive assumption that we could just walk into these places and change them overnight. I think that there is some valuable and proportionate use for counterinsurgency, as that story illustrates. I just think that we have to be much more realistic in what we do before we start doing it.
Chuck, if I could add just a couple of points on that, because I think it is important. I mean, first, I think the question is a good one, and I think we do need to think about that in terms of the inherent limits on what we're going to be able to do, given the kind of resources that we're willing to bring to bear. But by the same token, you know, the greatest mistakes of the Bush administration were in the arrogance of how they were thinking about doing things and what they thought was possible, especially in Iraq. Paul Hughes is in the back of the room. Paul suffered this firsthand because he was part of the team sent into Iraq who was basically told, you know, don't worry about it. The Iraqi bureaucracy will stay intact. You guys run things for a couple of months, and then Ahmed Chalabi will come and take over. There's not a single thing in that statement that I said that was accurate. But that doesn't mean that there weren't good ways to do it. And again, Paul and the people he was working with were trying desperately to do the right thing. And I think that you could see both in Iraqis at the time, and there were many Iraqis who desperately wanted our help to put their society together right, and who actually showed much greater forbearance than I expected from them in dealing with mistake after mistake after mistake that we made. And part of that was not harnessing what the Iraqis had to offer, but part of it was also the kind of the arrogant unwillingness to take what the rest of the international community had to bring to bear. No one has used the term United Nations today. Perhaps it's fitting that we talk about it as we go out of this panel. The United Nations, as opposed as many of its members were to going into the war the way that we did, immediately afterwards wanted desperately to be part of the reconstruction. The Germans and French led that charge. And we basically told them to go take a hike. And if that's not the height of hubris, and if that is not the right way to think about leveraging the role of the United States of America in the world and of employing all of the different strengths of our nation, I don't know what is.
Well, that's a good place to end. We're a little over our time limit, and it's chow time. Thank you for your attention and your intellectual involvement. Thank you to my colleagues on the panel who've done a great job for us today.